When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I don't know why I did that. Maybe because I had already cried too much in my heart before that day ever came. People often say that mothers never stop loving their children no matter what. I used to believe that too. I still do, I suppose. But love can sometimes hurt more than anything else in this world. My name is Mary. I'm 62 years old. For most of my life, I lived in a small white house at the end of a quiet street, the kind where neighbors wave from their porches and the mailman knows your dog's name. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. I raised my son, Daniel, there. Just the two of us after my husband passed away when Daniel was 12. Losing my husband broke something in me. But Daniel, he gave me a reason to keep breathing. He was my world. I worked double shifts at the local grocery store just to keep food on the table and save for his college. I remember sitting by the window every night, waiting for him to come home from school, still in his baseball uniform, grinning like life couldn't touch him. He'd say, "Mom, one day I'll buy you a big house with a porch swing and a garden." And I'd laugh. "I don't need a big house, honey. I just need you." That was our little world, small but full of love. Years went by faster than I expected. Daniel went to college, got a good job, and eventually met a woman named Claire. She was polite, beautiful, well-spoken, the kind of girl any mother would be proud to meet. When Daniel first brought her home for dinner, I remember she wore a soft blue dress and carried a pie she baked herself. I thought, oh, she's perfect for him. She called me Mrs. Miller at first, but later I asked her to just call me Mom. She smiled, though it felt like a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't notice the small things back then, the quick glances, the quiet sighs when Daniel and I talked too long about old memories. I was just so happy that my son had found someone to love. When they got married, I helped plan the whole ceremony. I pressed Daniel's suit myself. I still remember the way he looked at her that day, with so much love that it almost hurt to see. And for a while, everything was beautiful. They'd visit every weekend. Claire would help me in the kitchen, though she never really liked my cooking. Daniel would fix things around the house and tell me about work. But slowly, things started to change. It began with missed calls, then shorter visits, then small, polite lies. "Sorry, Mom, we're busy this weekend." "Oh, Claire isn't feeling well. We'll come next time, I promise." At first, I didn't mind. They were newlyweds. They needed their own space. I told myself that's what love does. It makes room. But one night, I called Daniel just to ask how he was doing. He sounded tired. I could hear Claire in the background saying something quietly. Then he said, "Mom, can I call you later? We're having dinner." I said, "Of course, honey." He never called back. Silence can be louder than words sometimes. It started to fill the spaces between us. Long pauses, awkward smiles, short answers. When I finally asked him if everything was okay, he said, "Mom, Claire just feels a little uncomfortable when you stop by unannounced." That one hurt. I had always come and gone freely. It was our home once. But I said, "I understand." And I tried to respect their boundaries. Still, I started baking cookies and leaving them at their door. I'd write little notes. Just a treat from Mom. Love you. Sometimes I'd find the box untouched when I passed by again a few days later. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a door closing. Months went by and I tried to keep busy. I joined a knitting club, volunteered at the church, and tried to smile when people asked about my son. He's doing great, I'd say, even though I didn't know for sure. But mothers always know when something is slipping away, even when they pretend not to. Then one spring afternoon, Daniel called. He said, "Mom, Claire and I were thinking maybe you could sell your house and move closer to us. We found a small apartment near our place. It would be easier for us to help you." At first, my heart leapt with joy. I thought, he wants me near him again. But then he said, "It's just Claire feels the old house is too far and you shouldn't live alone anymore." There was something in his voice, careful, rehearsed, like he was saying what she wanted him to say. Still, I agreed. I sold my home. Every memory, every piece of my life packed into cardboard boxes. I told myself this was for love, for family. When I moved into the apartment, it was smaller, quieter. Claire helped set it up, but she barely spoke to me. Everything had to be her way. The furniture, the curtains, even the color of the walls. She said, "It'll feel modern, Mom." But to me, it just felt cold. Daniel visited sometimes, but mostly with Claire. I noticed how she'd always answer for him, finish his sentences, change the topic whenever I asked personal things like his work, his health, his plans. It was as if she built a wall around him, and I was standing on the other side, knocking softly, waiting to be let in. Then came the first real sign of distance, my birthday. I waited all day. I made tea, set the table for 3. The clock ticked louder with every hour. Finally, at 9 p.m., Daniel called. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We got caught up with friends. We'll come tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. I sat there that night staring at the empty table, realizing that love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades, like light at the end of a long evening. But still, I couldn't let go. He was my son. And no matter how far he drifted, I believed he'd find his way back. What I didn't know was, a day would soon come when I'd see the truth, not in words, but in silence. And that silence would be the last thing we'd ever share. Some days, the loneliness in that little apartment felt heavier than my own body. I would sit by the window, watching cars pass, wondering which one might be Daniel's. He didn't come often. When he did, Claire was always with him. At first, I thought it was because they were busy. Young people have their own lives, their own plans. But over time, I started realizing something else. Whenever Daniel and I tried to talk, really talk, Claire would step in. If I asked, "How's work, honey? Are you still at the same company?" she'd answer, "Oh yes, he's doing fine, Mom. They're giving him new projects." Daniel would just nod quietly, like his voice no longer belonged to him. I used to think she was just trying to help, but there was a look in her eyes, soft but guarded, as if she didn't want him to remember who he was before her. One afternoon, I baked his favorite lemon cake. The recipe was from when he was 10 years old. He used to lick the spoon when I wasn't looking. I spent all morning in the kitchen, carefully mixing, checking the oven every few minutes. When they arrived, I said proudly, "Daniel, remember this? Your favorite." He smiled, but Claire said before he could speak, "Oh, Daniel doesn't eat sweets anymore. He's cutting down." She took the plate, placed it back on the counter, and started talking about some restaurant they'd been to last week. It was such a small thing, but it felt like someone had quietly erased a piece of our story. I began to notice every little moment that went missing. How Daniel never called me Mom in front of her anymore, just Mary. How she changed the subject every time I mentioned his childhood. How he avoided looking at me when she was near. I wanted to ask him what was wrong. I wanted to ask, "Do you still love me the same way?" But the words got stuck somewhere deep inside me, trapped between love and fear. Then came Thanksgiving. It was the one holiday that always meant something special in our family. Even when money was tight, we'd cook together. Mashed potatoes, turkey, pie, laughing the whole time. I used to think nothing could change that. So that year, I decided to host dinner in my apartment. I cleaned every corner, bought fresh flowers, and set the table for 3. I even used the nice china, the one Daniel's father and I bought on our first anniversary. When I called to invite them, Claire answered. Her voice was polite, but distant. "Mary, that's really sweet, but we already promised to have dinner with some friends. Maybe next year." Next year. That's what people say when they don't want to say never. I hung up, and for a long time, I just sat there, staring at the empty table. The candles flickered in the quiet. I thought about blowing them out, but I didn't. I just let them burn until they went out on their own. After that night, something inside me began to dim. I stopped calling as often. I stopped baking. I started talking less and thinking more. Weeks turned into months. I told myself that if Daniel needed me, he'd come. That's what sons do. They always come back to their mothers, don't they? Then one Sunday, out of nowhere, he called. "Mom," he said, "we're coming over. Claire wants to talk." I didn't know whether to feel excited or nervous. I cleaned the apartment twice. I even wore my best dress. The blue one, he said, made me look young and happy. When they arrived, I opened the door with a smile. But their faces, they weren't smiling back. Claire looked serious, almost rehearsed. Daniel kept his eyes down. We sat in the living room. The silence was so thick that I could hear my own heartbeat. Finally, Claire spoke. "Mary, we've been thinking maybe you should take a little trip. Visit some of your relatives or friends. You know, get some fresh air." I blinked. "A trip?" She smiled tightly. "Yes, you've been alone a lot. It might be good for you." I looked at Daniel. "Is that what you think too, honey?" He hesitated. "It's just, Claire feels you might be getting a little too dependent. We want you to be happy, Mom." Dependent. That word hit harder than I expected. I had never depended on anyone. I raised him alone, worked every day, paid every bill. I smiled, but it was one of those smiles that hides the pain underneath. "I see," I said softly. "You both want some space." Days later, I saw them at the grocery store. I almost didn't recognize Daniel. He looked different, older, quieter. I waved, but he didn't see me. Or maybe he pretended not to. Claire noticed, though. She gave me a small, polite nod and walked past without stopping. I stood there for a moment, pretending to compare prices on cereal boxes.
even though I couldn't read a single word through the blur in my eyes. When I got home, I cried for the first time in years, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears that no one else would ever know about. In the days that followed, I started noticing how everything reminded me of Daniel. The chair he used to sit in when we watched TV, the smell of his old shirts I still kept in the closet, even the sound of a text notification made my heart jump, hoping it was him. But the phone stayed silent. I began writing letters I never sent. Each one started the same. Dear Daniel, I hope you're doing okay. I miss you. By the end of the third letter, I stopped signing my name. Because what good were letters when he no longer wanted to read my words? Sometimes I'd walk by their house, not too close, just enough to see the lights in their living room. I'd imagine him sitting there laughing. I'd think, at least he's happy. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true. Then, one morning, everything changed. A letter came, not from Daniel, but from Claire. It wasn't handwritten, it was printed, formal, like something you'd send to an acquaintance. It said, Dear Mary, Daniel and I believe it would be best if we created a little more space between our lives. We'll reach out when things settle. Please understand this comes from a place of care. Claire. No love. No mom. Just Mary. I held that letter for a long time. My hands trembled so badly I almost tore it. I didn't cry at first. I just stared at it, reading it again and again, trying to find a hidden kindness in those words, but there was none. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed, whispering, he didn't write it. She did. He wouldn't say those words. But as the hours passed, I began to wonder, what if he did agree? What if in his silence he'd already chosen her side? That thought was harder to bear than the letter itself. The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove to a quiet cabin a friend once told me about. I didn't leave a note. I didn't call. I just needed to breathe. And as I drove away, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. A woman who had given everything, loved endlessly, and was now learning how to live with an empty space where her family used to be. I stayed in that cabin for a week. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was almost unbearable at first. But slowly, it became my companion. I walked along the trails, talked to myself, and thought about every memory I had with Daniel. Every smile, every scraped knee, every bedtime story I read to him. I held on to those memories like lifelines. Then I got a call from a neighbor. Mary, Daniel is asking about you, she said softly. My heart jumped, but I didn't respond. I sat on the porch, staring at the mist rolling over the trees, and wondered if I really wanted to talk to him. Part of me did. Another part wanted to protect myself from more hurt. A few days later, I decided to go back. I drove slowly, gripping the steering wheel tightly, rehearsing what I might say if I saw him. When I reached the street, everything looked familiar yet foreign. The house felt colder than I remembered. I rang the doorbell and waited. Claire answered, smiling politely, but it was the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Mary, Daniel's busy. Maybe another time. I wanted to argue, to step inside, to demand to see my son, but I stayed silent. I nodded, forced a small smile, and walked back to my car. That night, I called Daniel. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just said, can we meet? He paused. I don't think now is a good time, Mom. Maybe later. Later. The word struck me harder than any slap. Later had already passed, and I had no idea when he would come back. Weeks passed. I tried to keep busy, but nothing felt the same. Friends invited me out. I joined knitting circles and book clubs. I smiled when I had to, laughed when I could. But inside, the hollow feeling never left. Every dinner plate I washed, every cup of tea I made, reminded me of him. My son, my child, the one who used to need me more than anything, was slowly becoming a stranger. Then came the day when the truth hit me like a cold wind. I was at the grocery store picking up some vegetables when I overheard a conversation between two neighbors. One of them said, "I saw Daniel and Claire arguing yesterday. She's told him not to let his mother visit too much. Can you believe that?" I froze. My hands tightened around the shopping basket. My chest ached. I rushed home and sat in silence, trying to understand. Not because I didn't believe them, but because I didn't want to. I didn't want to face the reality that Claire had been shaping Daniel's life without me, that she had slowly, quietly built a wall between us, one brick at a time. That night, I tried calling Daniel. I left a simple message. "Please, just tell me the truth." Hours passed. No reply. I wrote him an email explaining how I felt, how lonely I was, how much I missed him. I sent it knowing that every word might never reach him the way I intended. Days later, Daniel called. His voice was quiet, careful. "Mom, Claire, she thinks it's better if we have less contact. She says it's complicated." I felt the world tilt. "Daniel, this is my son I'm talking to. Your life isn't hers alone." He hesitated, then said, "I know, Mom, but I have to listen to her." I couldn't breathe for a moment. It felt like the air had been pulled from the room. I wanted to scream, to beg, to fight, but all I could do was whisper, "So, you've chosen her over me?" There was silence. Then a soft, almost guilty, "Mom, it's not that simple." I realized then that it was simple. Claire had turned him against me. She had taken the boy I raised, loved, and sacrificed for, and placed herself between us. And he, my own son, was too afraid, too confused, or too loyal to see through it. I tried visiting again. I stood at the door, waiting for him to open. But he didn't. Claire answered instead. Her voice calm, polite. "Mary, Daniel's busy. Maybe another time." Another time. The word cut deeper than any wound. I went home and sat on the edge of my bed. I wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't come. My body felt numb, my heart hollow. I thought of all the birthdays I'd celebrated with him, the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the sacrifices I had made so he could have a better life, and now it seemed none of that mattered. I began to write again. Letters to Daniel I knew he might never read. I told him about my days, my thoughts, my love. I told him about the little things that reminded me of him. I told him I was proud of the man he had become, even if it wasn't the man I knew in my memories. Weeks turned into months. I accepted the fact that Daniel had been changed by Claire, that the warmth between us had been replaced with polite distance. And yet, I couldn't let go of hope completely. A mother's love doesn't fade like that. It lingers, quietly, painfully, in every corner of life. Then one evening, I received a text. Not from Daniel, but from Claire. Mary, Daniel and I have decided it's better if you spend some time away. We'll let you know when you can visit. I read it over and over. My hands shook. I didn't respond. I couldn't respond. The words were polite, but they were walls, not bridges.
I sat in silence, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I had given everything to my son, and someone else had slowly, carefully built a world where I no longer belonged. And the hardest part was knowing that he, my own child, had let it happen. That night, I packed a small bag. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to breathe, to be somewhere I could feel free from the quiet pain of being erased. I drove far, to a small town I had visited once long ago. I rented a tiny apartment near the lake. It wasn't home, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, I felt a little bit of peace. I spent my days walking along the shore, watching the sunlight ripple across the water. I thought of Daniel every day, but I allowed myself to stop hoping that he would come back. I realized that love sometimes isn't enough to bridge the distance others create. And yet, despite the betrayal, despite the quiet rejection, I couldn't hate him. I couldn't hate Claire. All I could do was grieve quietly and learn to live with a heart that had been broken gently, slowly, but completely. Weeks turned into months, and the quiet apartment by the lake became my new world. Every morning I would wake up, make a cup of tea, and watch the sunlight ripple across the water. It was peaceful, but it was also lonely. The absence of Daniel's laughter, his questions, his presence, it was a weight I carried every single day. Sometimes I would see families walking together along the shore, parents holding their children's hands, siblings laughing, and I would imagine Daniel there instead of me. I would imagine him smiling, happy, safe. And I would tell myself, if he's happy, then maybe that's enough. But some nights, when the wind whispered through the trees, when the moonlight danced on the water, the pain would come back in waves. I would cry softly, not for anger, not even for betrayal, but for the little things we had lost. The hugs that were no longer given, the phone calls that would never happen, the shared memories that now felt like strangers. One evening, I decided to write a letter, not to send, just to release the thoughts inside me. I wrote about the first time I held Daniel as a newborn, about the nights I stayed awake with him when he was sick, about the day he graduated, about the day he got married. I wrote about how much I loved him, even if that love had become a silent echo in his life. I folded the paper carefully, placed it in an envelope, and put it in a drawer. I knew he would probably never read it, but somehow that act made me feel lighter. Somehow, putting words down on paper reminded me that my love was still mine, even if it was no longer shared. The months passed quietly. I settled into routines. I bought small plants, started reading books I had once ignored, and even learned to cook a few new recipes. Life was slow, but it moved forward. And somewhere deep inside, I began to realize that I could survive this. I could carry the pain, but I could also carry myself. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from Claire. My heart stopped for a moment. I read the words carefully. Mary, Daniel and I have decided it is better if you do not visit us anymore. Please understand that this is final. I felt the floor beneath me give way. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and for the first time in months, the tears came freely. I cried not because I hated her, not because I wanted revenge, but because the last thread holding my son close to me had been cut. I sat there for hours, staring at the message, trying to find a way to understand, to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation that could ease the ache. There was no reason, no compromise, no bridge back to the life we had shared. I finally stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the lake. The water shimmered in the sunlight, calm and endless. I whispered softly, I love you, Daniel, always, even if you cannot hear me. I knew then that some separations cannot be healed, some betrayals cannot be undone. I knew that this was the end of the life I had imagined, the life where my son and I would grow old together, sharing laughter and memories. That dream had been quietly stolen, not by hatred, but by someone else's influence and his silence. The days that followed were quiet but steady. I focused on small things, tending to my plants, reading books, walking along the lake. I began to write again, stories and memories, filling notebooks with the love I could no longer give freely to him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of grief began to dull. I accepted that my life with Daniel, as I had known it, was over. That acceptance did not erase the pain, but it allowed me to breathe without waiting for a miracle that would never come. Years later, I still think of him often. I remember his laughter, his warmth, his presence, and I carry those memories gently, like fragile treasures that cannot be lost, even if they are no longer shared. I learned that love does not always mean togetherness. Sometimes love is knowing when to let go, even when it hurts more than words can describe. And though my heart remains heavy with the absence of my son, I have found a quiet strength in surviving it, in holding on to the love I gave so freely, and in remembering that even in separation, love endures. The apartment by the lake became my sanctuary. It was lonely, yes, but it was mine. And in that loneliness, I found a strange kind of peace, a reminder that even when life takes away what we cherish most, the love we carry never dies. I never saw Daniel again after that final message. Claire had won in her own quiet way, and he had chosen her over me. And though it was the hardest thing I have ever endured, I learned to live with it, to carry it quietly, and to keep loving, even in absence, even in silence, even in loss. Time passed, and the world around me moved on. Seasons changed. Snow fell in winter. Flowers bloomed in spring, and the lake mirrored every sunrise and sunset. Life carried on, but for me, it carried on without Daniel. I never visited him again. I never heard his voice, except in my memories. Sometimes, late at night, I would imagine him walking through the door, smiling, apologizing for the distance, and hugging me tightly. But those were only dreams, gentle illusions I let myself have when the loneliness was too heavy to bear. I lived quietly in that small apartment, carrying my memories like precious stones. I wrote letters I never sent, kept old photos in a box under my bed, and sometimes I would trace his face in them, remembering how his hair smelled when he was little, how he used to laugh at the smallest things. Friends would visit, sometimes reminding me of what life could still offer. They tried to make me smile, to encourage me to move forward, but no amount of conversation could fill the space where my son's love used to live. It was a hollow space, carved out by years of distance, manipulation, and choices I could not change. I forgave Claire in my heart long ago, not for her sake, but for mine. Carrying anger would have been too heavy. I forgave Daniel, too, in my mind, in my soul, even if not in reality. I forgave him for listening to someone else over his own mother. I forgave him for forgetting the small moments that built our bond. I forgave him because hate would have chained me to a life of sorrow. And yet, forgiveness did not erase the truth. He was gone from my life. My son, the boy I had nurtured, the man I had loved more than life itself, had chosen another path. I had to accept it, to live in the reality of his absence, and to survive the quiet ache it left behind. Some nights, I sit by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the soft hum of the world outside. I think of Daniel, and I whisper into the darkness, "I hope you are happy. I hope she treats you well. I hope life is kind to you." And even though my heart breaks a little each time, I smile softly, because love, even when unreturned, is never wasted. I learned that a mother's love is both fragile and strong. Fragile because it can be pushed aside, ignored, or misunderstood. Strong because it survives absence, betrayal, and the quiet erosion of a bond that once seemed unbreakable. My love for Daniel did not die when he walked away. It stayed alive, quietly, patiently, like the lake that mirrored the sky outside my window. I will always remember him. I will always carry him with me. And though our lives are no longer intertwined, and though the finality of our separation is a wound that never fully heals, I have found a kind of peace in knowing that I loved him as fully as a mother can. And that love, even in absence, is eternal. Sometimes, when the sun sets over the water, I feel him near, not as a presence, but as a memory, a whisper, a heartbeat in my soul. And I whisper back, "I love you, Daniel, always." The days continue, quiet and steady. I live, I breathe, I remember, and I survive. Because that is all a mother can do. Love,
even when it breaks her heart. And in that love, even in tragic separation, there is strength.